area and all the way up north. And Dominguez was one of his soldiers. So when that campaign was finished and Vegas, his superior, was appointed governor of Baja California, they often rewarded their meritorious soldiers with lands in those days. And he gave them 76,000 acres, which comprised the entire peninsula, all the way to Wilmington, all the way to Redondo Beach, all the way to Rosecrans. So that's a sizable chunk of land, and it was called, you know, the the Rancho de Palos Verdes or something like that. And then after him came several other famous families, Sepulvedas, etc., etc. We hear those names all the time. Machados, many families intermarried and so forth. And so it's a very involved history, and those of you who are history buffs could go to the history room at the library and check up on those things. Otherwise, you know, I don't want to bore you forever, but it's kind of fascinating. And in the end, the cattle business declined because of drought, because of mismanagement, family squabbles, lawsuits for land ownership, all these things. And in the end, a man by the name of Bixby bought the land and also farmed cows and sheep. Didn't initially farm, but had a manager he hired, a man named Phillips, who decided that he should offer farming land cheap for $10 an acre for Japanese families. And that flourished to the point that before the turn of the 1900s, and early 1900s, at the time was 60 Japanese American families farming this peninsula right here. And since they're very thrifty and they were very good farmers and very hard workers, they managed to squeeze actually a sustainable lifestyle out of this farming here. When they farmed down below, they could actually raise, during the rainy season, they could actually raise a certain amount of fruit, but like tomatoes, vegetables like that. And as they came up the hill and it got drier and drier, they had to go to soya beans, to barley, and lima beans, things like that. And that really went on almost into the 70s. Many of you that have lived here a long time remember that it was certainly the flower farm, the Ishibashi farm, flower farm, and the Ishibashis, of course, are have a long history of living here and farming here and having their flowers stand down below when Annie was still alive and her husband Maz and so forth. And of course then they were unfortunately because of war scares and general misery of World War II, they were put into internment camps, and of course that destroyed a whole culture of farming and of people that loved the peninsula and did very many good things and supported the communities in many ways. But you know, when war happens, things fall by the wayside. We found two more plants here. This one is called horehound. It's actually a non-native. You see it all over the peninsula, but it is good for medicinal purposes. A tea can be made out of it, but mainly it is still to this day put into cough drops. So it's still usable. It's a bit of a weed. I mean, it proliferates and so forth, but it sort of has an interesting history. This one here actually is called a cliff aster, and it is a California native right here, and you'll see that a lot on hills. It spreads underground, and so if you plant it, realize that it may spread. But it's a neat plant. It gives us flowers almost all year long, and cheerful white flowers. And I always like it. Keeps well in the vase. You can use it sort of like baby's breath. And I always enjoy it when I see it. We stopped here because we found a prickly pear cactus that isn't that prickly. It's called Opuntia indico, and it is raised for food. In the Mexican cuisine, it's nopales. They harvest these pads when they're younger, obviously, and they're cooked and sort of cut up, and they're sort of eaten like beans, like green beans. And I think they're very tasty with, some butter and salt on it and stuff like that. And this homeowner extended his yard. This is basically illegal, all right? Because this is a fire road and this is the preserve. But at the time, the city didn't own this particular part. It was still privately owned. As you know, the city purchased this part, so presumably they'll I have to do something about this. But it's a good comparison between something that's a hybrid meant for food and the native, which is right here, the golden spine prickly pear. We stopped here because we have our first California bush sunflower blooming, trying to bloom. It's nice and green. There's also a cliff aster in between and a big fat weed. We're going to rip that out. There we go.
Where's the cliff aster?
And it was right here. This one here, just coming out. This is another weed here. But it's that's what they look like in spring if we get enough rain. And as you know, when you travel along even Crenshaw Boulevard, when these are in bloom, or even along Hawthorne, it just is so cheery and so beautiful. And so it all depends on the rains, as you well know. It also is a good garden plant. If you, again, have an area that you're looking for to plant somehow with natives to save on water during the summer, if you give it a little water, a couple of times of good soakings during the summer, it will just keep blooming. Otherwise, being used to Mediterranean type climate, as in California, they tend to go dormant in the summer. As water is not available anymore, the California plants react by going dormant. And that's why with so little rain since last winter, for the longest time on our walks, all the plants look dead. And it's really hard because you're saying, well, when the rain comes, this will be a beautiful plant, but right now it's dead as a doornail. Right. And so that makes it a little hard. So when things green up and get pretty, then we're thrilled and we have something to show you. It'd be very hard for the camera to pick up. This raven will now harass this hawk, okay? And then the way you can tell a raven from a crow, the easiest way is when they're flying, because the raven will have a sort of a wedge-tailed, rounded-off tail. When they're both sitting on a fence, particularly singly, you kind of look and you think, okay, this is a big bird now. Is this a raven or is this a crow? If you had them side by side, the raven is much bigger. But when they fly, it's really easy to tell because the crow will just have this cut-off tail in the back, straight. And the raven, and when you watch now, you'll see that they have wedged tails. But everybody harasses everybody. They will harass this big red tail who would probably, tell them a thing or two. The little kestrels will in turn bother the ravens, and the mockingbirds will bother the cats. And I mean, they all bother each other. See, here comes the raven. See very clearly, he's steering with his tail. Yeah. And the ravens are very smart birds. They live in small family groups. That's another sign whether it's a raven or a crow. Crows tend to be in flocks. And, you've had them in your neighborhood. They all sit in a tree and scream. Very loud. Very loud. And the ravens are all just family units. They're also superb flyers. They do the same aerials that the hawks can do. They roll and they dive and then they go up again. It's very beautiful. And they're super smart birds. They can also be pesky. They take young birds, as do crows. But we have them. They seem to be stabilized. For a while, 30 years ago, there were very few ravens, and it was very special to see a raven. Nowadays, you see them more often, and the crows have proliferated to a point where they're pests, unfortunately. And it's just another thing that goes after the songbirds, and the songbirds are unfortunately declining dramatically everywhere. And the crows are here, particularly, are a reason for that, because not only eat eggs, they eat the young birds, they go into all the garbage cans, throw out the stuff, very messy. They're just a general pest because there's too many, a couple wouldn't make a difference. Tonight it's time to tell you about Mr. McBride. Mr. McBride was a very unusual individual, and I think, like most of you know, there's occasionally individuals in the world who seem to be a notch above everybody else. Either brilliant scientists, philanthropists, just people that love their fellow man, do a lot of good generally, just people that are somehow special. And Mr. McBride was born in 1902, and always was born on a farm, very hard, had to work very hard as a child on the farm, went on from there to basically work extremely hard all his life. first enlisted in the Merchant Marines, and from there he went on to various other jobs. He was an oil construction worker, I gather. Ended up working at a metal plating company here in LA later on in his life, and worked always really hard in what you would call a blue-collar job, but obviously he was a very honorable and what should I say, upstanding human being, among other things. And when he was 2 years short of retirement, when he was 77 years old, he had moved into a condo here, near here, and was observing as these multi-million-dollar homes were being built and the whole place was graded and so forth. And there was a trail here that was almost inaccessible. It was very rocky, difficult to walk on, just wasn't what you would call a really nice trail. So he was afraid that once he retired 2 years later, that he would get bored, because being such a hands-on man all his life, he started working on this trail. He took it upon himself. He took a shovel and buckets and started grading this trail from his home. Every day he would come out here and grade this trail. And he worked on that for 17 years.
By himself?
By himself. He had occasional helps from one of his sons. He had 6 children, but I mean they were adults. They had their own lives, and he just didn't want to be bored. He didn't want to get old. He was a very healthy person. He was a health nut, what we would call a health nut nowadays. Very particular what he ate, very careful, but obviously it was a very hard worker also. And eventually he did retire, and he moved to Utah to be near one of his daughters. But then came back in 1988 and saw the trail, and the trail had deteriorated dreadfully. It had not been taken care of. It wasn't up to his standards, and he was very disappointed. So he went to the city of RPV and complained and said, this isn't right. So actually, bless our heart, the city sent him out with city workers, and under his leadership, they improved the trail. And the trail nowadays, of course, is wide enough for a fire road, so a fire truck can get in if necessary. And after that, the city realized what a great job this single man had done, they actually named the trail after him. And then in 1996, he came back as I think he was 97 or something, and visited and came on this walk. I have pictures of him with us here on this walk. It was so much fun, and we were so honored that he would come, and very sprightly still, walked the entire trail, and no problem at all. It was a great honor. And in 2000, and he died in 2004 at the age of almost 102. Wow. And this was actually, McBride Trail was for many, many, many years the only really official trail that RPV had, because everything else was privately owned land, lots of trails, but technically illegal because we were all walking on just open space and not wasn't official trail. So the only really official trail was always McBride Trail, and so that that's an interesting piece of history. So they had interviews in the papers about him. His daughters and his relatives and grandchildren talked about him and what a special person he was. So it's a pretty neat legacy that he has left us. All right, we stopped here. We want to talk a little bit about the Vanderlip estate and the role that the Vanderlips played on this peninsula. After we had Dominguez and Sepulvedas and Bixby's, Father Bixby bought the land from the Machado Sepulveda families after their fortunes went downhill a little bit, and he bought 16,000 acres off the original ranch. And he farmed it for a while, and then his son George took over. And George Bixby was the one that I told you about before that encouraged Japanese farmers to come and farm the land. And after about 20 years of doing farming, he was really kind of tired of this whole deal and decided to sell his land, the 16,000 acres. And at the time, there was a real estate investor by the name of Fundenberg, and he interested the New York banking community, including Mr. Vanderlip, in this property. And but it was unseen. They had never been here. And so they